ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome and welcome to our EB5 experts panel. We will be discussing the journey of investment and immigration through the EB5 program. So you've already been introduced. I don't have to do that. So let's just jump right into it, shall we? All right. So any of you can answer this. Please feel free. It's a very basic questions, and if Matt forgets to give some info, then you can jump in, Rhea. What is an EB5 visa? You can each give some.
So EB5 is an immigration program via investments. Each investor has to invest $800,000 into the American economy and create 10 American jobs. That's how you get your green card in the US.
So it's 800,000
Correct.
US dollars. That's
Correct.
the minimum investment.
Correct.
Okay.
And a couple things to add to that. What I always like to say to people is, EB5 in the US is a jobs creation program. And that's what's so important about looking at an EB5 investor visa. You got to make sure that you understand all the hoops that have to be jumped through, so to speak. So it's really important when you're looking at EB5 to pick a great regional center, one with a great track record, because to the investor, they're making this investment. Their goal is to achieve permanent residency in the United States. But the US government wants to know about how their project, how their investment is going to create jobs. And that's what it's all about in EB5.
Okay.
Right. I'd just like to add on to this that what distinguishes EB5 as compared to all other visa programs to the US is that it's the fastest and the most expedited way of securing US permanent residency. And what's also special about this program is that it enables you to have a work permit and a travel permit without restrictions. So it essentially enables you to do a job without an employer sponsorship. It allows you to run a business. It allows you to pretty much do everything that a US citizen would like to. So that's essentially why the EB5 visa program is favorite for one and all.
Thank you, Akshat. Abhinav, would you like to add anything? They've said it all. All right, Akshat, you said it was the fastest way. How long are we looking at?
So as of the latest references that we've seen in the industry, EB5 is divided into two stages, right? So the conditional green card and then the permanent green card. I think it would be optimistic to say that we've seen references of people obtaining their conditional residency as early as 6 months to 2 years, whereas the entire program, I would say, is a journey of 5 to 6 years in terms of obtaining your permanent residency, as well as getting the capital back.
Okay, but the initial step, the initial would be 6 months?
Yes, as long as you're probably based outside the US. Right. Obviously, since you asked that question, for someone who's based out in the US on a valid visa category, and this is one of the favorite points about the new act for me personally speaking. So as per the new act, it allows you to file concurrently an adjustment of status, which is the I-485 application, along with the conditional green card application, which is the I-526E. And what's special is that this application allows a person based in the US to get a work and travel permit as early as 3 to 4 months. So while my conditional green card could come, let's say, in 6 months to 2 years, I'm pretty much using or deriving the benefits of a conditional green card residency as early as 3 to 4 months from the date of application.
Okay,
Yep.
I understand. Go ahead, Matt.
It might actually be helpful for me to add a little background and nuance to it as well. So the original EB5 program, including the Regional Center program, became very, very popular starting really 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16. But backlogs started to form from certain countries. The country limits the number of visas that are available for EB5 investors, and then below that also limits the number of visas available for investors from certain countries. So countries that use the program very heavily, like China, India, and Vietnam, started to form backlogs. And so when we talk about how long it takes, a lot of you might have heard in the past, well, EB5 isn't really fast, it's not really viable because of these backlogs that it formed. But in March of 2022, the US Congress passed a new bill called the EB5 Reform and Integrity Act of 2022. And what that bill did is it not only reauthorized the program, but it also created a couple of different categories to allow them to set aside visas for investors who invest in certain types of TEA projects, either rural projects or high unemployment area projects. And so the reason why it's possible that we're going to see much faster timeframes for people to be able to enter the program on an EB5 visa is because people who invest in those categories under the new program actually get to jump the line. They get to be a part of those visas that are currently available rather than going into the backlog queue that formed prior to the EB5 Reform and Integrity Act being passed. So that's an important thing to note, and that's part of why EB5 is really back in a big way throughout the world, but in particular in those countries that were backlogged, where demand had started to fall away because of those long visa wait times.
Okay. And are there specific targeted areas in the US, or go ahead, Abhinav, or can I just choose any destination of my choice?
So the EB5 investment amount varies by the region where you're investing. If you are investing in a targeted
Abhinav, put it a little closer to your mouth, please.
If you're investing in a targeted employment area, which is designated by USCIS or United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, your investment amount is $800,000. Now, these TEAs can either be high unemployment, rural, or rural areas. High unemployment areas are the ones where the unemployment rate is 150% of the US national average. And rural areas, there's no economic criteria. It is simply any area that has a population of 20,000 people or less. It could be, and it's away from a metropolitan area. It could be a really affluent area up in the mountains or say Napa Valley. It's, like I said, it's not an economic criteria. So here your investment amount will be $800,000. And then any area that's outside of targeted employment areas, the investment amount is $1.05 million.
Okay. Can you give me some examples of places in the United States where these criteria would fall?
Sure. So a targeted employment area can be anywhere. It is purely a mathematical calculation. So we talk about San Francisco Bay Area, wherein there's Silicon Valley, downtown San Francisco, all of that, which is high employment. But then if you jump across the bay to Oakland, which is again considered San Francisco Bay Area, you'll find pockets that have an unemployment rate of 150% of the national average. So right there, next to one of the most affluent regions, is your targeted employment area. Rural, as I mentioned, there are a lot of mountain towns which are really affluent. They end up being rural. Or I know CMB does a lot of projects that are logistics-based, so I'll let you answer.
Yeah, and one more thing to add. So from the high unemployment area standpoint, you can find these areas, and you're looking at geopolitical subdivisions that are broken down where data is collected by the U.S. Census Bureau and and the Bureau of Labor Statistics to provide information on how many people are employed in those regions. And so when you gather that information, you can look at it, analyze it, and try and determine if it meets that criteria. But the important thing to note, as Abhi had said, that you can look at it in pockets of unemployment. So they might be kind of a diamond in the rough sort of situation where you find a small area that does qualify, but it could be part of a larger high unemployment area. We also try and look for projects that, and one other thing to note, you can invest anywhere. It's just that if you invest outside of one of these areas, it's $1,050,000. And in that situation, you're not investing into one of these set-aside categories, you're joining the longer backlog. The big overarching theme, and I mentioned it earlier, it's a job creation program in the United States. The US government's trying to drive foreign investment dollars into areas of critical need, areas that it's harder to get financing. And typically speaking, those are areas where they're a little less affluent, they're a little bit higher unemployment, or they're rural. They're outside of metropolitan areas where it might be agricultural land, or it might be unused land that is uninhabitable, or things like that. It could be anything, right? And so really the goal is to try and drive dollars into those regions.
Right, so it definitely stimulates job creation in those rural areas, I guess.
It's also important to understand why these areas are a topic of discussion, especially for an Indian national, an Indian born, having projects in the rural area and investing into them are seeing faster processing times, which is why rural areas, high unemployment areas are doing better for these investors because it's more in demand now because there are faster processing times. So that's why of late this is more a topic of discussion, and most regional centers have their projects in rural areas now, high unemployment areas now, to only catalyze this whole process.
I'd just like to add something to this. So since you asked about a few references and examples, right? We at USIF have done a couple of high unemployment area projects that have been bang on Times Square. So when I meet an investor and I tell him that this is a high unemployment area project and this is at Times Square, it just doesn't add up. And the reason is that they don't consider the unemployment rate in just that census tract, but they also consider the unemployment rate in the nearby census tracts. So as long as cumulatively, as Abhi mentioned, if it's 150% and above, it qualifies as a high unemployment area. So it's more of an economic statistician-driven answer, not from a common sense perspective that Times Square cannot be a part of high unemployment area. Yeah.
Very true. Well, thank you very much, panelists. We have a much better understanding of the program. Let's move on to the regional center. So what is the role of a regional center, in your opinion?
Sure, so I'll take this one. So an EB5 regional center is really just a business entity that's applied to receive designation to operate under the EB5 program. There's a whole application process that you would have to go to. You form this business entity and you submit all of this information on how, in particular, how you're going to create jobs in a specific region. That's where the regional center concept comes from. So you have to define that area. It might be a single census tract, a very small area. It might be a county, a state, or it could be multiple states. You define that area. You have to provide supporting job creation analysis. You have to demonstrate to the U.S. government how you're going to aggregate investors, how you're going to structure EB5 investment offerings, and then ultimately how you're going to take a compliance role to monitor that process all the way through to be able to work for those clients throughout the entire process. So a couple other things to mention about this. A regional center can be a business entity that just holds that designation, but they don't really do anything within the program other than sponsor a project. A developer might come along and say, hey, can I sign a deal with your regional center to use your designation? But the developer is the one actually aggregating the EB5 investors and putting the petitions on file. Groups like, actually I think all of these groups up here, we are a different model. We own the regional center designations, but we also work as kind of a one-stop shop. We are entities that go out there and try and find investment opportunities for EB5 investors and structure them so that they fit the program. We then build all that documentation that's necessary to submit their petitions to the US government, and then again, monitor them throughout that process, calculate job creation, and provide that information to the client so they can ultimately make their green card permanent.
How many regional centers are there, out of curiosity?
Yeah,
hundreds.
So my company alone, I think we now have 18 regional center designations. We cover the vast majority of the United States, but so some groups will have multiple regional centers so they can take on projects in different areas throughout the US, and then other groups may just have one, but at one point in time there were 900. I think it's maybe 500 or 600 that are still around right now.
Okay. So you're a support system, basically. You're a support system for the different investors, right? From beginning to end, really.
Yeah, so you're a government, you're not a government entity, but you're designated by that government entity to operate within the program. But you're the one who's responsible for making sure that project is compliant with USCIS rules and regulations and making sure ultimately that that investor is successful throughout their process.
So is it fairly easy to ensure that laws are being abided by, that your investors are doing everything in a timely manner, so on?
So a regional center ideally acts as a fiduciary. We see that the funds that are invested by the investors are managed. We see that for the investors, we see that there are 10 jobs created per investor. We see that the exit strategy of the project is stable so that investors get their money back in their due course of time. So we are basically acting as a fund manager for all these investors.
Does the US government have a specific time frame for all of this to be completed by the investor?
It depends from a project to project. So different projects have different timelines. Some projects get completed in 3 to 4 years time, some in 5, 6, 7 years. It just depends on the project size.
And yes, go ahead, before we move on.
Yeah, so just to add on here, right, essentially a regional center is an organization which is also licensed and authorized by the USCIS, right? So it's not just someone coming up tomorrow and saying that I can market EB5 project opportunities for you. It's essentially a company or a body which has a license, which is answerable to the USCIS on whatever they're doing. I always tell my investors that the investors are the clients to a regional center. Their green card and return of capital is sort of what we strive for. And developers are basically partners who we are getting together with in terms of completing a successful project. So that's how we look at it.
Right, all right. And now the golden question. Why are investors choosing to file for EB5 visa?
Well, I'll jump in again, and then we'll get the mic to you, Abhi. So, primary motivating factor that we've seen throughout the entire history of EB5 is children. It's giving their children an opportunity to live in the United States, study in the United States, or remain in the United States after they've completed education. The US H-1B program is a little bit volatile. It now requires a new renewal and lottery program, and so it's a little bit complicated. And then when the administration changes, sometimes there's pressure put on that program to retract it. It's very unlikely that they'll dramatically expand it, right? So the other bad thing about H-1B is that you're tied to your employer. You don't have freedom of flexibility to go look for other employment opportunities or do something on your own. You have to maintain that sponsorship. Because EB5 is that one investment for you, and it covers any unmarried children under the age of 21, it can be a family opportunity. It can be an opportunity to plan your family's future in the United States. And once your kids have their green card, they can live anywhere, work anywhere, study anywhere, and then after school, obviously freedom of opportunity for seeking employment.
I'll just add that EB5 means different things to different people. It just depends on your stage of life. So a typical journey of any immigrant in the United States, especially of South Asian or Middle Eastern descent, is you enter the United States as a student, then you go on and look for a job, work for someone, and then eventually you want to become a permanent resident, you have a family, etc. What EB5 does is, instead of relying on visas at every step, it straight away gives you a green card to the United States, which means unrestricted access. For a student, that means you don't need a visa. It means more internship opportunities, etc. For someone who's entering their professional life, they are not dependent on an employer to live and work in the United States. And lastly, for someone who already has an employer who has sponsored them for a green card, you're not an indentured servant. You have that freedom to live and work anywhere for whoever you want. And also, if you want to start your own firm, a startup, etc., EB5 visa gives you that freedom. So it just means different things to different people, and that's why they do it.
But what you're saying, Abhinav, is EB5 is the fastest way to a green card.
Correct. For a lot of nationalities, primarily South Asian diaspora, Asians from China, etc., other visa categories, both family sponsorship, employment sponsorship, is so backlogged, in certain cases by 50 or 60 years, that there will be a time when you enter the United States, you give birth to your child, and that child is a US citizen at birth, turns 21 and sponsors you faster than your own employment green card. So that's, EB5 is way faster. It's in like 1.5 to 2 years time.
Once I obtain this green card, because I've received my EB5 visa, does my family right away, are they allowed to join me right away?
Yes. So an EB5 application has a primary applicant, so that'll be the investor, and then you have qualifying dependents that comprise of your spouse and unmarried children below the age of 21. Everyone gets a green card together, and it also means for certain families that you have an additional paycheck in your family. Because a lot of times if you're on a work visa, your spouse is not allowed to work. And so green card adds a paycheck to your family as well.
Fantastic. Why has there recently been a spike in the interest in this EB5 visa? Something happened recently?
So the spike happened post March 2022. We are in this EB5 2.0 phase. So the primary reason for the spike was back in the day, you had to wait for an approval. If you were in the United States, you had to wait for an approval of your application, and then you file what's called adjustment of status to get a green card. But if you're a student and your period of study has expired, you had to exit the United States. You did not have any interim right to live in the United States. In March of 2022, when Congress passed the new laws, it allowed people to adjust status simultaneously. So if you're studying and your period of study expires, you still get to live in the United States. You also get a temporary work permit, which allows you to work in the United States while you wait for a green card. And that has one of the biggest reasons for a spike. And the second is now even the H-1B visa professionals get to do the same thing. Earlier, if you had filed an EB5 application, you get fired and you can't find an alternate employer, you had to leave the United States. Today, with all these Amazon layoffs, Twitter, etc., people are able to file this EB5 application, apply for adjustment of status, and continue to live and work in US without the fear of their children losing out a year in education because they'll all have to exit.
Why do you think that the US government is being so much more flexible like that with their laws? And I find it incredible.
So weirdly, this is the first time EB5 is at parity with other employment-based categories. This always existed for employment-based first, second, third, fourth category, never for EB5.
Okay.
So they just made EB5 equal.
Fantastic. All right. Well, how does the EB5 visa investment structured, and what are the terms of investment?
Right, so I'll start with it, and probably then Matt and Abhi or Rhea.
Yes, we're going to more detail now.
Sure. So essentially, EB5 investments are structured by a regional center in the form that in any typical EB5 project, you would see a developer, you would see a senior lender, which is, let's say, a bank or a financial company, and you would see a portion of EB5 funds entering into the project, right? Any healthy mix of a project would have a decent about 20 to 30% contribution from the developer, let's say about 40 to 50 minimum percentage from a bank loan, and then the remaining would be EB5 funds. Essentially, what we've seen in the industry is that project tenures were previously about 5 to 7 years, but as of the latest amendment that was released by USCIS, where they spoke about the minimum 2-year of sustainment period for investors to get their money back, what we've seen is investment tenures have sort of now reduced to 3 to 5 years. So you'll generally see projects where you're entering into a minimum investment of 3 years, and the developer has, let's say, 2 optional annual 1-year extensions. So that would be generally my thoughts on the same.
Another easy way to say it, I mean, the program allows for you to structure these investments really any way you can dream up. I mean, there's a basic core to the structure that has to remain the same. The investor has to invest into an entity that they'll call a new commercial enterprise, a new business. And then that business has to make those EB5 funds fully available to the project, the group that's going to create the jobs. Outside of that, you can structure it as a pure equity investment. CMB, one of my colleagues noted earlier, was the first to come out with the loan model back in 1997. And so in that model, we're having investors make an equity investment into a limited partnership, but we're pooling those funds and making a loan to a borrower, that job creating entity. That's become a pretty standard model. I think most regional centers use that now, but there are a number of different ways after you get through that first initial step of structuring that you can do it. It can be, first lien construction debt. It can be preferred equity. It can be mezzanine debt, collateralized different types of ways. And in part, that's what's really important about looking at the project that you're considering very carefully. You want to know how it's structured. What's the risk profile? You know, debt may carry a little bit less risk profile than something that's pure equity. So those are the types of things that you have to consider.
Abhinav?
I'll just add to it. So the aim of a regional center, and I think if you understand the structure, you'll understand it better how it works. So the aim of the regional center is to A, get you a green card, B, create American jobs, and C, repay your capital. That is capital preservation.
Can you just repeat the third one, please?
Preserve capital,
Preserve capital.
and repay it to the investors. So
Okay.
it's not a typical investment, which is you buy a house and it's not like you're getting that money back. In EB5, you invest your capital with a set 4 or 5 year loan term, and you do get your principal back. So we are primarily a lending institution for real estate projects. That's how it's structured. So your money comes in the form of your investment into a regional center sponsored entity, and from there it's loaned to a project for a period of 5 years, and after 5 years the project repays the entity and you get your money back. So that's the easy structure of EB5.
You mentioned some specific cultures. You mentioned Southeast Asia. When they are looking to invest in the United States, clearly they don't have much background information on the different regions that they can invest in and so on. So how do you guide them, since we're talking about these, you know, the terms of investment and so on, how do you guide them through this process? Go ahead.
So ideally, you can invest into any project across the United States.
But do you give them
But-
some sort of a background of
Correct.
where?
But if you're coming from an area like from China, from India, who have a backlog, you try and see a project in the rural area, especially after the Reforms and Integrity Act. You see a project in the rural area because it gives you faster processing times. You get your conditional green card approved way faster than you would ideally get it in, let's say, a high unemployment area.
Yes.
So that's how, you know, when you're talking to an investor from multiple regions, you give them the idea depending on where they're coming from.
Okay, so you give them the idea. They don't come to you and say, I want to open an apple orchard in New York State. Or,
I work mostly with Indian investors, and they're very well informed.
okay,
Right.
that's what I wanted to know.
Yes, they're very,
How
very
much-
well informed.
Okay.
So they would come and ask us what's in our portfolio, and
Okay.
based on what suits them best, they go forward.
So they've done their homework.
Yes.
Yes. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
All right, so two things, right? There are two types of EB5 visa programs, the direct program and the regional center program, right? So all of us four here represent the regional center program, which means that when an investor comes to us, there are a set number of projects that we have in our portfolio which they can get access to or invest in. We always tell our investors that when you're looking at EB5, you're pretty much talking to two entities. So you're speaking to a regional center that will basically guide you on the entire process of your investment, your repayment of capital, the investment tenure, what's the project underwriting, etc. But at the same time, simultaneously, you're also in touch with an immigration attorney, which is basically guiding you step by step on the process of your conditional green card, permanent green card, etc.
Right.
So I would say that if anyone here is looking at EB5, you should parallelly do both the steps for you to be able to achieve to your end goal.
Okay. And if someone here is interested, how would they access your portfolio? Is it open to the public? Can I visit?
Yeah, so one
Yeah.
key thing to understand too is that all of these investments are done in the form of a registered securities offering in the United States. So essentially what happens, and Abhi noted that we're kind of like lenders. We go out and we try and find projects, or sometimes developers come to us and say, hey, can you finance my project? But what happens is then you're negotiating the terms of that deal, but then you're building a registered securities offering that's monitored and governed by the Securities and Exchange Commission. So when you're out there, after you've formed that partnership, you're marketing it. You're coming to events like these, you're maybe doing online marketing or traveling overseas to meet people in person, or working through foreign channel partners and things like that to present that information to people. But when they want to review the actual project, they're not just looking at a glossy flyer. They're getting a full private placement memorandum that's part of a securities offering.
Fantastic. I'm going to open it up to the audience, as I'm sure that several of you have questions for this panel. Yes, sir, if I can have a microphone.
What I will have to do is
Yes,
steal a microphone from you, wonderful people. Thank you very much. Sir.
So, what is the typical return on that investment for?
On an EB5 investment?
Yeah.
All right, I'll start, and if anyone wants to join. And that's our favorite line here. So the typical return on an EB5 investment is your permanent residency to the US. This is one of our favorite questions when we especially come to Dubai, because people have an expectation of great returns. But I think it's our duty to upfront mention the fact that your greatest return on an EB5 investment is just your residency. So you're typically looking at negligible returns from an EB5 investment.
Thank you.
Can anyone add something else?
So he's absolutely correct. Your return is your green card. However, you will find projects in the market that give you a higher return. At EB5 Capital, we actually have a project in Washington, DC, that's giving you a 4% return. So you'll find various projects, but most projects are very low on return.
Your ROI depends on the structure of your project, obviously. So there are private equity kind of projects wherein you are at a preferred equity position, senior to equity, junior to all the debt. They tend to give a return of, like Rhea mentioned, 3 or 4%. But then there's the debt model, which gives a return of between 0.25 to 1% typically. And the reason for that is because developers take debt from us because we are cheaper than a bank loan, right? So if there is a spread of 6%, we can only give 0.25 to 1% to our investors because our cost of raising capital ends up being about 2.5%. So we are making about 2.5% on the money we raise every year. That's the math.
Thank you.
All right, questions.
Any other questions?
I've got microphones here for you. Who's got a question?
How should we choose a regional center?
How should we choose a center?
Well, how should we choose a regional center? Yeah, I mean, I'll make it easy. Choose mine. No, it's really what it is you're gonna want to do due diligence. If you do basic online research, you can find a lot of information on regional centers. You can read articles about their projects. You can try and understand who they are by looking at information on their track record and the groups that they've worked with. But that's something that you really need to do personally. I wouldn't exclusively rely on somebody else to, tell you exactly what to think about a group. You want to put your own eyes on kind of some of that background research as well. When it comes to picking a regional center, it's the combination of that, and then it's comfort level with the project that they're offering. And that's going to be a huge determining factor. You might find a number of great regional centers that are historically fantastic, but one might have a project that just stands out to you as being safer, or more conservative, or more attractive in some way, shape, or form. And so it's really your choice.
Thank you.
I'll just quickly add to that, if I may. It's like choosing a fund manager, like any financial investment. So you look at the track record, and then you look at where the money is being invested. Two things. So you talk about the track record, you find out about the successes and the failures, reasons for the successes and the failures. So that's the fund manager, aka the regional center. And then you have to carry out due diligence on the project where your money will go, because a good regional center can have a bad project, and a new regional center with no track record can have a really good project. So it's both. It's the regional center and the project that are important.
That's a good question, though. How much competition is there, actually?
So I would say that it's a pleasure to be on the panel today, because all the 4 regional centers here are one of the top and premier regional centers when you talk about EB5. I would sort of break it for you, sir, in 2 ways, right? So you have 2 goals: the permanent green card and the security of capital. And I completely agree with Abhi when he said that you look at the regional center, you look at that track record, but most importantly, you evaluate that particular project. Because your money and your green card is dependent on the project, not the overall success or the track record of the regional center. When we look at these two aspects, I generally divide them into 3 questions each. So from a permanent green card perspective, I ask my investors to ask 3 questions to anyone who they meet. Number 1, what are the total number of investors in your project? Number 2, what are the total number of jobs that your project will sort of make? And number 3, are there any currently created jobs in the project that you're going to invest in? So that's from a permanent green card perspective. From a security of capital perspective, I again tell my investors to ask 3 questions. Number 1, has the project begun construction? Does the project have a senior lender or a bank or a financial institution backing that particular project? And the third and the most important question is, does this project that you're partnering with that particular developer, has that developer done EB5 in the past? And what's been the track record of success with that particular developer? So I guess when you ask these 6 questions, the place where you get the best 6 answers from, I think would be the safest project to invest in my opinion.
Thank you, Akshat. Any last question for the panel? Yes.
Thank you. So you said that the investment could be provided to one developer as a loan for 5 years and then could be back. My question, how to relate the job creation as 10 job creation to that single investment since it is already injected in one single capital?
So job creation in the regional center context is different from what we see in the real world. There are two or three kinds of jobs that are counted, and one is the direct job, which is construction workers working on a project for a period of 2 years or more. So once the 2-year mark passes, the jobs are created for eternity. And then the next 2, induced and indirect jobs, is simply based on spending, wherein there are economic models that have been approved by USCIS, which simply state if you invest $100 million on this census tract, on these materials, concrete, glass, wood, etc., these many jobs are created in the US economy. And all those jobs get attributed to the EB5 investors.
Any last one? That's it then. Well, thank you very much we have another one. Fantastic.
So the regional center is in it to make money, right? So what kind of profit do you make from each project? And are you all demanding the same kind of profit back from developers like myself, or how does that work?
So a typical model, like I mentioned, if it's a debt model, every regional center is probably making between 2.5% to 4% per annum. On an average, we raise about $100 to $150 million. So that's what we make. And it just varies.
Yeah, and the way you broke it down earlier was actually fantastic. The regional centers that are a debt model like ours, we live off the spread and the loan. So a portion of that is covering upfront costs. A portion of it might be paying, referral fees to people who are working with clients throughout the world. But then what we make off of that spread, whatever's left, is, I will tell you, critically important. You don't want your regional center to go out of business while you're going through your immigration process, right? So you also want that regional center to have some wherewithal over time, because if something goes wrong with your project, what's going to happen? Are they going to walk away from it, or are they going to potentially use some of their own capital to start that fight, to enforce terms and conditions of their loan agreements? There's a lot of groups that just walk away.
So that varies between 2% and 4%, your return, okay, depending on the project?
Yeah, in terms of, total profitability off of a project, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
EB5 panelists, thank you very much for being with us today and for giving us more than an overview on the program. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for our first panel of the day. Thank you.